Everyone thought David stayed late to steal overtime pay. His ruthless billionaire boss, Victoria Sterling, wanted him fired immediately. But walking into his cubicle at midnight, she found something that shattered her cold heart and exposed a multi-million-dollar corporate cover-up. Prepare for a story of ultimate sacrifice. David Miller's eyes burned as he stared at his glowing monitor, a spreadsheet of meaningless numbers blurring together into a sea of gray. His watch read 11:45 p.m. The entire 14th floor of Sterling Enterprises was a graveyard of empty cubicles and silent ringing phones, save for the hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard. To the rest of the company, David was a ghost, a 32-year-old senior financial analyst who wore the same 3 threadbare suits, drank the terrible break-room coffee, and never, under any circumstances, went home at 5 o'clock. His colleagues whispered that he was milking the company for overtime. They joked that he didn't have a life outside of his cubicle. They didn't know about Chloe. 7-year-old Chloe was David's entire universe, a bright, fiercely intelligent girl with a laugh that could shatter the darkest moods. She was also born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome, a severe congenital defect that required a series of terrifying, astronomically expensive surgeries. David had spent every penny he had, drained his 401k, and taken out crippling personal loans just to keep his little girl breathing. 6 months ago, the bank had finally foreclosed on their modest 2-bedroom apartment. David had nowhere to go, but he had a badge that granted him 24-hour access to the climate-controlled, secure fortress of Sterling Enterprises. David. The sharp, nasal voice sliced through the quiet of the office. David flinched, his heart hammering against his ribs. He turned to see Marcus Thorne, his direct manager, leaning against the partition of his cubicle. Marcus was a man who wore $2,000 Italian suits and possessed the empathy of a rattlesnake. He was a rising star in the corporate hierarchy, largely because he was a master at taking credit for other people's labor. "Marcus," David said, quickly minimizing a window on his screen. "What are you doing here so late?" Napped. It's... I could ask you the same question, Miller," Marcus sneered, checking his Rolex. "Almost midnight again. You know HR flagged your hours yesterday. You've racked up more overtime in the past month than the rest of the department combined. It's a bad look. It screams inefficiency. I'm just making sure the Q3 projections are flawless." David lied, his voice tight. "The upcoming merger requires precise modeling. I didn't want to leave any margin for error." "Right, the merger," Marcus said, his eyes narrowing. "Listen to me, David. I've carried you for 2 years because I felt sorry for your little sob story regarding your kid. But patience has limits. Victoria Sterling herself is reviewing department overhead tomorrow morning. If she sees your bloated timesheets, she'll demand a head on a spike. And it won't be mine." Marcus leaned in closer, his cologne suffocatingly strong. "I want you out of this building by midnight. Every night, if you can't finish your work in a standard 40-hour window, I will find someone who can. Are we clear?" David swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in his throat. "Crystal." Marcus offered a tight, terrifying smile, patted the wall of the cubicle, and walked away, the click of his expensive leather shoes echoing down the hall. David waited until he heard the elevator doors chime and close. As soon as the floor was silent again, he let out a shaky breath, buried his face in his hands, and allowed himself 10 seconds of quiet despair. If he lost this job, he lost his health insurance. If he lost his health insurance, Chloe would be removed from the transplant list. It was a death sentence, plain and simple. Wiping his eyes, David stood up and walked toward the heavy oak doors of the filing room at the far end of the corridor. It was an antiquated room, rarely used since the company digitized its records 5 years ago. He unlocked it with a spare master key he had quietly copied from the janitor's cart months ago. Inside, tucked between a row of metal cabinets and a massive commercial printer, was a makeshift bed created from old foam packaging and thick winter coats. curled up in the center, breathing softly through a nasal cannula connected to a portable oxygen concentrator plugged into the wall, was Chloe. She clutched a worn plush rabbit, her small chest rising and falling in a fragile rhythm. David knelt beside her, brushing a strand of brown hair from her pale forehead. She stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. "Daddy?" she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the oxygen machine. "I'm right here, sweetheart," David murmured, forcing a warm, reassuring smile onto his face. "Just finishing up some superhero work. How are you feeling?" "My chest hurts a little bit," she confessed, rubbing her sternum. "Are we going to our real house soon?" The question felt like a physical blow. "Soon, baby," David promised, the lie burning his tongue. "Daddy just has to finish this one big project, and then we're going to get the nicest house you've ever seen, with a backyard and everything. Go back to sleep. You're safe here." Chloe nodded, trusting him implicitly, and closed her eyes. David watched her for a long time, the terrifying reality of his situation pressing down on him. He wasn't just staying late to give Chloe a warm place to sleep. He was staying late because he had discovered something terrible in the Q3 financials. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a cruel manager, he was a thief. Over the last 3 years, Marcus had been systematically siphoning millions of dollars from the corporate accounts, funneling them through dummy vendor contracts. David had stumbled upon the discrepancies by accident 2 weeks ago. He had been quietly working every night to compile an ironclad evidence trail. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. He hoped that by presenting the evidence directly to the CEO, he might secure a promotion, a bonus, or at the very least enough job security to keep Chloe alive. But Marcus was getting suspicious. The walls were closing in and David was running out of time. Victoria Sterling did not tolerate failure, and she despised inefficiency even more. At 34 years old, Victoria was the youngest female billionaire in the country. She had inherited Sterling Enterprises from her father when she was 28, taking a struggling manufacturing conglomerate and violently restructuring it into a dominant tech and logistics empire. The media called her Iron Victoria. She wore the title like a badge of honor. She had sacrificed her youth, her personal life, and her capacity for mercy on the altar of her company's success. It was 1:15 a.m. on a Thursday, and Victoria was sitting in her glass-walled penthouse office on the 50th floor, overlooking the glittering skyline of the city. Her desk was a pristine slab of black marble, currently occupied by a single manila folder. The folder had been hand-delivered by Marcus Thorne earlier that evening. It contained the termination request for a senior financial analyst named David Miller. Victoria flipped open the file, her sharp, calculating eyes scanning the documents. According to Marcus's report, Miller was a parasite. He logged an average of 65 hours a week, yet his output was barely average. Marcus had painted a picture of a lazy, incompetent employee who stayed late to read news articles, watch videos, and drain the company's overtime budget. Gross negligence, Victoria muttered to herself, tracing the edge of the paper with a manicured fingernail. In the middle of a massive acquisition deal, she could not afford dead weight. A pen hovered over the signature line that would sever David Miller from Sterling Enterprises permanently. But something in the file made her pause. Victoria was a creature of data. She cross-referenced everything. She pulled up the raw server logs on her secondary monitor. If David Miller was watching videos and surfing the web for 25 hours of overtime a week, the network traffic would show it. She punched in Miller's employee ID. The server logs populated instantly. Victoria frowned. There was no streaming traffic. No social media. In fact, Miller's terminal was accessing the most restricted, deeply buried financial archives of the company's legacy systems. He was pulling raw data from 3 years ago, data that had absolutely nothing to do with his current assignment on the Q3 projections. Furthermore, the keystroke log showed he was working at a frantic, highly complex pace, running advanced regression analyses that were far above the pay grade of a standard analyst. Why was an allegedly lazy employee running advanced audits on old company files at 1 in the morning? Intrigued and slightly irritated by the mystery, Victoria pushed her chair back. She didn't like middle managers handing her incomplete narratives. Marcus Thorne had lied on this report, whether out of ignorance or malice. Victoria decided she was going to find out why. She left her penthouse suite, the heels of her Louboutins sinking silently into the plush carpet as she bypassed the executive elevator and took the service lift down to the 14th floor. The air on the 14th floor was stale and smelled faintly of ozone and old coffee. Victoria moved like a shadow, navigating the labyrinth of cubicles. As she approached the financial wing, she saw the faint glow of a single monitor illuminating the gloom. She slowed her pace, expecting to catch David Miller in the act of whatever corporate espionage or unauthorized moonlighting he was conducting. She stepped quietly around the corner of his partition. David wasn't looking at his screen. He was asleep. He was slumped over his keyboard, his cheek resting on a stack of printed spreadsheets. He looked completely defeated, his face pale and lined with deep, dark circles of exhaustion. His suit jacket was draped over the back of his chair, exposing a frayed, heavily starched dress shirt. Victoria felt a flicker of disgust. Sleeping on company time, she thought. She reached out to slam her hand on his desk and wake him, ready to fire him right there on the spot. Then she heard it. It was a soft, rhythmic hiss-click, hiss-click. The sound was mechanical, totally out of place in an office environment. Victoria's gaze shifted past David, following the sound toward the dark hallway that led to the old filing rooms. A sliver of light spilled from beneath the heavy oak door of Archive Room 4. Her instincts, honed by years of corporate warfare, flared. Was he stealing physical documents? Was he meeting someone? Leaving David snoring softly at his desk, Victoria walked silently toward the archive room. The door was slightly ajar. She pushed it open, stepping into the dusty, cramped space. She froze. For the first time in her professional career, Victoria Sterling was completely speechless. There, nestled between towering cabinets of old tax returns, was a child. A little girl, swaddled in a corporate-branded winter coat, fast asleep on a bed of bubble wrap. Beside her, a portable oxygen concentrator was plugged into the wall, pumping life-saving air through a plastic tube into the girl's nose. On a small folding table next to the makeshift bed were a few meager belongings. A plastic container of cheap instant noodles, a box of crayons, a stack of heavily redacted medical bills, and a framed photograph of David holding the little girl before she looked so frail. Victoria stepped closer, her heart doing a strange, unfamiliar flutter. She looked down at the medical bills scattered on the table. The numbers were staggering, hundreds of thousands of dollars. Final notices, threats of collection. Next to the bills was a thick, leather-bound notebook. Victoria picked it up. It wasn't a diary. It was a meticulous, handwritten ledger. She flipped open the pages. Her breath hitched. It was a master map of embezzlement. David had painstakingly tracked millions of dollars being diverted from Sterling Enterprises. He had found the dummy corporations, traced the routing numbers, and documented every single fraudulent transaction. And at the top of the pyramid, circled in red ink, was the name of the man orchestrating the theft. Marcus Thorne. Victoria stared at the child, then at the notebook in her trembling hands. The puzzle pieces violently snapped into place. David Miller wasn't stealing overtime. He was homeless. He was hiding his critically ill daughter in her building because he had nowhere else to go, and he was staying awake until 2 a.m. every night, slowly building a case to save the very company that was about to fire him. A sudden, sharp gasp came from behind her. Victoria spun around. David was standing in the doorway of the archive room, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked at Victoria, then at the notebook in her hand, then at his sleeping daughter. "Miss Sterling," David whispered, his voice cracking, tears instantly welling in his eyes. He dropped to his knees right there on the dusty floor, his hands trembling. Please don't call the police. Fire me. Do whatever you want to me. Just don't call child services. Please, she's all I have." I'll pack up right now. I'll disappear. Trough. And Victoria looked down at the broken man on the floor, the ruthless Ice Queen facade fracturing in real time. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the dusty archive room was the rhythmic mechanical hiss of Chloe's oxygen concentrator. David remained on his knees, his hands trembling violently, his eyes squeezed shut as he braced for the final blow. He expected the harsh, nasal tone of security being called. He expected to be physically dragged from the building. Instead, he heard the soft rustle of expensive fabric, followed by the quiet click of Victoria Sterling's heels against the linoleum. "Get up, David," Victoria said. Her voice wasn't laced with the venom she was famous for. It was dangerously calm, carrying a weight that forced David to open his eyes. She was looking down at the heavy, leather-bound notebook in her hands, her sharp eyes scanning his meticulous handwriting. "This dummy corporation," she murmured, pointing to a diagram David had drawn in red ink. "Meridian Freight. You're saying Marcus Thorne has been routing our overseas shipping payouts into this shell company, and then dispersing the funds into private Cayman accounts?" David swallowed hard, struggling to find his voice. "Yes, Mom. He started small 3 years ago, falsifying invoices for negligible amounts. But over the last 8 months, he got greedy. He siphoned almost $4.2 million. I found the discrepancies while cross-referencing our legacy vendor files with the new digital database. Abandonable. Thorell. Margarel. Victoria flipped the page, her expression unreadable. "And why didn't you bring this to HR? Why the cloak and dagger?" "Because Marcus is the vice president of regional finance," David whispered, glancing nervously at his sleeping daughter. "He has friends on the executive board. I'm a replaceable analyst. If I went to HR without an ironclad, undeniable paper trail, he would have buried me. He would have fired me, revoked my health insurance, and—" David's voice broke, "and Chloe would lose her spot on the transplant list. I couldn't risk her life. I had to be absolutely sure." Victoria looked from the ledger to the frail little girl sleeping on the bubble wrap. She saw the stack of final medical notices. She saw the instant noodles, the reality of what her company had become, a machine where a thief thrived in luxury, while a brilliant, desperate father lived in a closet to keep his child alive hit her with the force of a freight train. The mud was the first persona carefully cultivated over a decade of cutthroat corporate warfare, cracked right down the middle. She pulled a sleek smartphone from her pocket and dialed the number. David's heart plummeted. "Ms. Sterling, please." Victoria held up a single finger, silencing him. The call connected. "Robert," she said, her voice instantly snapping back to its usual commanding authority. "Rick up. I need my private medical transport team at the loading dock of the main tower in exactly 15 minutes. Contact Dr. Thomas Vance at Presbyterian General. Tell him to prep the VIP pediatric suite. I have an incoming patient with hypoplastic left heart syndrome." David stared at her, his jaw completely slack. Victoria hung up and looked at him, her piercing gaze softening just a fraction. "Pack up her things, David. We are leaving." "Leaving?" David stammered, tears spilling over his lashes. Where are we going?" "To get your daughter out of a filing room and into the best cardiac facility on the eastern seaboard," Victoria replied, slipping the ledger under her arm. "And then, Mr. Miller, you and I are going to sit down in my office, drink some very expensive coffee, and plan exactly how we are going to absolutely destroy Marcus Thorne." The next 3 hours were a blur of surreal, breathtaking efficiency. Victoria's private security team arrived with a specialized medical transport. Chloe, still half asleep and confused, was gently moved onto a stretcher and whisked away in a state-of-the-art ambulance. David rode in the back, holding his daughter's hand, while Victoria followed behind in her black town car. At Presbyterian General, doors that usually took months of waiting lists to open flew wide apart at the mere mention of Victoria Sterling's name. Dr. Vance, one of the top pediatric cardiologists in the country, was waiting in the lobby. Within an hour, Chloe was resting in a massive, sun-lit suite equipped with the finest medical technology available, hooked up to hospital-grade oxygen and monitored by a team of private nurses. David sat in the plush armchair next to her bed, his face buried in his hands, weeping silently. The crushing weight of the last 2 years, the fear, the cold, the exhaustion, was finally lifting. Around 4 a.m., Victoria walked into the hospital room. She had traded her suit jacket for a cashmere sweater, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. She handed one to David. "Doctor, Vance just gave me the preliminary assessment," Victoria said softly, pulling up a chair. "Her condition is critical but stable. More importantly, I've just authorized a blank check to the hospital from the Sterling Foundation. Chloe's surgeries, her recovery, her medications, it is all fully covered. You don't owe another dime." David looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with disbelief. "Why?" He choked out. "You don't even know me." "Because you did the impossible, David," Victoria said, tapping his leather notebook, which now rested on the small table between them. "You protected my life's work while carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. You are the most brilliant forensic accountant I have ever encountered. But more importantly, I allowed a culture to fester in my company where a monster like Marcus felt comfortable, and a man like you felt terrified. I am fixing my mistake." She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing with a familiar, dangerous glint. "Now, walk me through the Meridian Freight transactions. At 9 o'clock this morning, Marcus is presenting the Q3 financials to the executive board, and I intend to give him a performance review he will never forget." Nah. Ass. At 8:55 a.m., the executive boardroom on the 50th floor of Sterling Enterprises was buzzing with quiet, confident energy. The massive mahogany table was surrounded by 10 of the company's highest-ranking officers. At the head of the table stood Marcus Thorne. He was wearing a brand-new tailored charcoal suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a smug, relaxed smile playing on his lips. He was ready to present the quarterly projections, take the applause, and officially finalize the termination of the deadweight known as David Miller. It was going to be a beautiful Friday. At precisely 9 a.m., the heavy glass doors swung open. Victoria Sterling walked in. The room instantly fell silent. Victoria's face was a mask of carved marble. She didn't sit down. She walked slowly to the opposite end of the table, her piercing eyes locked dead onto Marcus. "Good morning, Victoria," Marcus said smoothly, clicking his remote to bring up a colorful pie chart on the massive screen behind him. "I've prepared the Q3 overhead analysis. As we discussed, I've identified several areas of gross inefficiency in the financial sector, namely a senior analyst named David Miller. I submitted his termination papers last night." "Yes, you did," Victoria said, her voice echoing coldly in the cavernous room. "You claimed his output was abysmal and he was stealing overtime." "Exactly," Marcus nodded, feigning regret. "It's unfortunate, but we must protect the company's bottom line." "I agree," Victoria said. She snapped her fingers. The glass doors opened again. 2 people walked in. The first was David Miller, dressed in a fresh suit Victoria's assistant had procured that morning, looking exhausted but entirely resolute. The second was Detective Reynolds of the city's white-collar crime division, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. Marcus's smug smile vanished, instantly replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. He gripped the edges of the podium. "Victoria, what is this? Why is Miller here?" Victoria ignored him. She tossed a thick stack of printed documents onto the center of the mahogany table. "Those are the raw data pulls from the legacy servers, authorized by Mr. Miller over the last month. They detail a highly sophisticated embezzlement ring routing $4.2 million into a shell company called Meridian Freight." Ars como true. What works? Oh, drafts. A collective gasp echoed around the table. The board members scrambled to pick up the documents. Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. He forced a harsh, condescending laugh. This is absurd. Victoria Miller is framing me. He's a desperate man about to lose his job. If you check the digital routing logs, you'll see the approval signatures for Meridian Freight all originated from Miller's IP address. He's the thief. That is the twist, Marcus, Victoria said, leaning over the table like a predator about to strike. You are very good at digital manipulation. You perfectly framed David on our current networked service. But you forgot one crucial detail. Sterling Enterprises didn't fully digitize vendor contracts until 2022. Marcus froze, the blood draining entirely from his face. David wasn't auditing the current network, Victoria continued, her voice rising in power and volume. He spent his nights in the physical archive rooms. He found the original carbon-copied paper invoices from 2021, the ones that couldn't be digitally altered, the ones bearing your physical handwritten signature, Marcus. And just to be thorough, Mr. Miller traced the Cayman routing numbers directly to an offshore account registered to your brother-in-law. The silence in the boardroom was absolute, broken only by the sound of handcuffs rattling. Marcus Thorne, Detective Reynolds said, stepping forward and grabbing the vice president's arm, pulling it behind his back. You are under arrest for corporate fraud, grand larceny, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent. So, me off. Marcus didn't fight. He couldn't. He stared in absolute horror at David, realizing that the quiet, broken man he had tormented for 2 years had meticulously engineered his complete destruction. As the police marched the disgraced executive out of the boardroom, Victoria turned to the stunned executives. Marcus Thorne is terminated, effective immediately, she announced, her voice leaving no room for debate. And as of this morning, David Miller is promoted to Chief Risk Officer of Sterling Enterprises. He will be spearheading a complete top-to-bottom audit of all regional finances. She looked at David, a genuine warm smile finally breaking through her icy exterior. Welcome to the executive board, David. 6 months later, the 14th floor was a distant memory. David stood on the wooden deck of a beautiful, modest 3-bedroom house in the suburbs. The sun was shining, painting the green backyard in warm golden light. He was holding a spatula, flipping burgers on a brand-new grill. A sliding glass door opened, and Chloe ran out into the yard. Her cheeks were flushed with healthy color, her eyes bright and full of life. There were no oxygen tanks, no tubes, just a vibrant 7-year-old girl who had received a successful heart transplant 4 months prior, thriving with a second chance at life. Sitting at the patio table, sipping a glass of lemonade, was Victoria Sterling. She looked relaxed, dressed in jeans and a simple blouse, a stark contrast to the billionaire CEO the world knew. She had become a fixture in their lives, a fiercely protective aunt to Chloe, and a trusted mentor to David. You're burning the burgers, Miller, Victoria teased, pointing at the grill. David laughed, turning the meat. I'm a chief risk officer, Victoria, not a Michelin star chef. He looked out at his daughter, chasing a butterfly across the grass, and then at the woman who had saved them both. David had once thought he was entirely alone, fighting a losing battle in the dark corners of a cold corporate machine. He had been prepared to lose everything. Instead, out of the darkest night of his life, he had found justice, salvation, and a family. David's terrifying ordeal proves that sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear capes. They wear threadbare suits and sacrifice everything for their children. If this story of a father's unbreakable love and a CEO's unexpected redemption touched your heart, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.